On June 28, 1914, two gunshots in Sarajevo ignited a powder keg that would consume the world. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria is taught in every history classroom as the spark that triggered World War I, a conflict that would claim 17 million lives and redraw the map of Europe forever. But here's what most people don't know. Franz Ferdinand himself was one of the most vocal opponents of war with Serbia. The man whose death started the Great War had spent years arguing against the very conflict his assassination would unleash. His life story reads like a tragic novel. A sickly child who never expected to rule, a forbidden love affair that scandalized an empire, a devoted father whose children were deemed unworthy of their own heritage, and a would-be reformer whose progressive ideas threatened the establishment so much that some historians believe it made him a target. Today we're going beyond the textbook version. This is the full story of Franz Ferdinand, not just how he died, but how he lived. Because understanding this man's complex, fascinating, and ultimately tragic life is essential to understanding how the modern world was born.
Franz Ferdinand Karl Ludwig Joseph Maria
Was born on December 18th, 1863, in Graz, Austria, into one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, the House of Habsburg. But despite his royal blood, no one expected this child to ever wear a crown. His father was Archduke Karl Ludwig, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph I, which made young Franz Ferdinand third in line to the throne, a position that, in the stable Habsburg succession, seemed comfortably distant from actual power. His mother was Princess Maria Annunziata of Bourbon Two Sicilies, and by all accounts, she provided the warmth in an otherwise rigid household. But tragedy struck early. When Franz Ferdinand was just 7 years old, his mother died of tuberculosis, a disease that would haunt him throughout his life. This loss shaped him profoundly, leaving him in the care of his strict conservative father, who raised him in an atmosphere of rigid Catholic discipline and Habsburg tradition. Franz Ferdinand was not a healthy child. He was frequently ill, struggled with respiratory problems, and lacked the robust constitution expected of a Habsburg archduke. To make matters worse, he was overshadowed by his younger brother Otto, who was more charismatic, more socially adept, and frankly, more likable. In the competitive world of the imperial court, Franz Ferdinand often found himself struggling for attention and validation. But in 1875, when Franz Ferdinand was just 11 or 12 years old, something extraordinary happened that would change his life forever. His childless cousin, Francis V, Duke of Modena, died and left his entire fortune to the young Archduke. This wasn't just any inheritance. It was one of the largest fortunes in Austria, including vast estates, palaces, and the prestigious Este title. There was one condition: Franz Ferdinand had to add Este to his name, becoming Franz Ferdinand d'Este. He accepted, and overnight, this sickly overlooked prince became one of the wealthiest men in the empire. He now had the resources to live independently, to pursue his passions, and to build a life on his own terms, a freedom that would prove crucial in the years to come. Still, despite his newfound wealth, Franz Ferdinand remained third in line to the throne, behind his uncle, the emperor, and his own father. The throne seemed a distant prospect, something he would never actually have to worry about. History, however, had other plans. January 30th, 1889. The news that reached Vienna that morning sent shockwaves through the empire and changed Franz Ferdinand's life forever. Crown Prince Rudolf, the emperor's only son, the heir to the throne, and Franz Ferdinand's cousin, was found dead at his hunting lodge in Mayerling. He had died in an apparent murder-suicide pact with his young mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera. The scandal was enormous, but more importantly, the Habsburg succession was now in crisis. With Rudolf dead, the line of succession shifted to Franz Ferdinand's father, Archduke Karl Ludwig, who became the new heir presumptive. Franz Ferdinand himself moved up to second in line. The throne, once a distant abstraction, was suddenly much, much closer. But Franz Ferdinand didn't have long to adjust to this new reality. In 1895, he contracted tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed his mother. This wasn't a mild case. He became so gravely ill that the court physicians gave him little chance of survival. The emperor and his advisors began grooming Franz Ferdinand's younger brother Otto as the likely heir instead, assuming Franz Ferdinand would die just as his mother had. Then, in 1896, another tragedy struck. Archduke Karl Ludwig, Franz Ferdinand's father and the heir to the throne, died of typhoid fever after drinking contaminated water from the River Jordan during a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Franz Ferdinand was now the heir presumptive, except he was dying of tuberculosis. For 2 years, the succession hung in limbo. Franz Ferdinand fought his illness with every resource his estate fortune could provide. He traveled to warmer climates, sought the best medical care available, and slowly, miraculously, began to recover. It wasn't until 1898, when he was finally declared disease-free, that he was officially named heir to the throne. But this long period of uncertainty had consequences. Emperor Franz Joseph had never been particularly close to his nephew, and the years of doubt about Franz Ferdinand's health had created a distance between them that would never fully heal. The emperor had prepared himself mentally to bypass Franz Ferdinand entirely, and now he was stuck with an heir he hadn't really wanted. For his part, Franz Ferdinand was acutely aware of this tension. He knew he was seen as a second choice, a compromise heir who had survived when he wasn't supposed to. This knowledge bred resentment and mistrust that would poison his relationship with the emperor for the rest of his life. Their meetings were legendary for their hostility. One courtier later wrote that thunder and lightning always raged when the two men met. They disagreed on nearly everything: politics, military matters, foreign policy,
and especially on a matter we will discuss shortly:
Franz Ferdinand's choice of wife. Before the weight of succession fully settled on his shoulders, Franz Ferdinand did something remarkable for a Habsburg archduke. He saw the world. In 1892 and 1893, before he became heir presumptive, Franz Ferdinand embarked on a circumnavigation of the globe. This wasn't a brief European tour. This was an epic journey that took him to India, Ceylon, Australia, Japan, and North America. He even attended the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, experiencing firsthand the industrial and cultural dynamism of the United States. These travels shaped his worldview in ways that would influence his later political thinking. He saw how other empires managed their diverse populations, witnessed different systems of government, and developed a broader perspective than most of his insular Habsburg relatives. But Franz Ferdinand had another passion that he pursued with almost obsessive intensity: hunting. Now, aristocratic hunting was common in this era, but Franz Ferdinand took it to an extreme that shocked even his contemporaries. He kept meticulous records of every animal he killed, and those records reveal staggering numbers. Over his lifetime, he killed between 272,511 and 274,899 animals. Sources vary slightly on the exact count, but we're talking about well over 250,000 creatures. His personal record was 2,140 kills in a single day. At his Bohemian castle, Konopiste, he displayed over 100,000 hunting trophies. The walls were covered with mounted heads, antlers, and preserved specimens. Visitors described it as overwhelming, even macabre. Even Emperor Franz Joseph, who was himself an avid hunter, called his nephew's hobby mass murder. But hunting wasn't Franz Ferdinand's only passion. He was also an avid collector of antiquities and historical artifacts. Unfortunately, he lacked the expertise to distinguish genuine pieces from forgeries, and unscrupulous dealers took advantage of him repeatedly. His collection was filled with fakes, though he never seemed to realize it. He had better luck with architecture and historical preservation. He served as protector of the Imperial Central Commission for Architectural Conservation and took this role seriously, involving himself in debates about preserving Austria's historical buildings. However, his taste was decidedly conservative. He opposed the Viennese modernist movement and blocked several projects by the renowned architect Otto Wagner, favoring neo-Baroque styles instead. And then there were the roses. Franz Ferdinand loved roses, with a passion that seems almost incongruous with his reputation as a cold, difficult man. At his estates, he cultivated thousands of rose beds, personally overseeing their care. He would press flowers in books, creating botanical collections that revealed a gentle aesthetic side of his personality that few people ever saw. These passions, the hunting, the collecting, the roses, paint a picture of a complex man, someone with deep enthusiasms and a need to control and catalog his world. But the greatest passion of his life, the one that would define him more than any other, was about to begin. In 1894, Franz Ferdinand attended a ball at the palace of Archduchess Isabella in Pressburg, modern-day Bratislava. There, he met a woman who would change his life forever, Countess Sophie Czarek von Chatkowa und Wagnin. Sophie was serving as a lady-in-waiting to Archduchess Isabella. She came from an ancient and respected Bohemian noble family. The Choteks had been part of the aristocracy for centuries. She was intelligent, graceful, and by all accounts, genuinely kind. Franz Ferdinand fell deeply, irrevocably in love. There was just one problem. Sophie wasn't royal. In the rigid hierarchy of the Habsburg court, there was an enormous difference between ancient nobility and ruling dynasties. The Choteks were nobles, yes, but they weren't from a family that ruled territories. They weren't of equal birth. And Habsburg law was crystal clear. The heir to the throne could only marry someone from a ruling dynasty. Franz Ferdinand didn't care. For once in his life, this difficult, proud man had found someone who made him happy, and he refused to give her up. But they had to keep their relationship secret. For years, they conducted a clandestine courtship, meeting in private, exchanging letters, falling deeper in love, while knowing that the empire would never accept their union. The court assumed Franz Ferdinand was actually courting Archduchess Isabella's daughter, Marie Christine, which provided perfect cover for his real relationship with her lady-in-waiting. The secret came out in the most dramatic way possible. Archduchess Isabella discovered a locket that Franz Ferdinand had left behind. She opened it, expecting to find a portrait of her daughter. Instead, she found Sophie's photograph. The scandal was immediate and enormous. Isabella was furious. She informed Emperor Franz Joseph, who summoned his nephew and forbade the marriage outright. The emperor made his position clear. Franz Ferdinand could be heir to the throne, or he could marry Sophie Chotek. He could not do both. For most men, in Franz Ferdinand's position, this would have been the end of the story. The throne of Austria-Hungary was one of the most powerful positions in Europe. Giving it up for love would have been unthinkable. But Franz Ferdinand refused to back down. He told the emperor he would not marry anyone else. If he couldn't marry Sophie, he simply wouldn't marry at all. What followed was a standoff that lasted for years. The emperor was adamant. Franz Ferdinand was equally stubborn. The court was scandalized. The succession was in jeopardy once again. Finally, some of the most powerful figures in Europe intervened on Franz Ferdinand's behalf. Pope Leo XIII himself wrote to the emperor, arguing for compassion. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who had become a friend of Franz Ferdinand, added his voice. Even Tsar Nicholas II of Russia weighed in. Faced with this international pressure, and perhaps recognizing that his nephew truly would never marry anyone else, Emperor Franz Joseph finally relented in 1899. But his permission came with devastating conditions. The marriage would be morganatic. This medieval term meant that Sophie would not share her husband's rank or title. She could not be called Archduchess. She could not appear with Franz Ferdinand at most official court functions. She would have to walk behind even the youngest Habsburg archduchesses in any procession. And most cruelly of all, any children from the marriage would be excluded from the succession. They could never inherit the throne.
On June 28th, 1900,
14 years before his death, Franz Ferdinand stood before the assembled archdukes and ministers in the secret council chamber and formally renounced the succession rights of all his future descendants. It was a humiliating ceremony, designed to emphasize what he was giving up. The wedding itself, held at Reichstadt in Bohemia, was equally humiliating. Emperor Franz Joseph refused to attend. So did Franz Ferdinand's own brothers and most of the archdukes. The only members of the imperial family who came were his stepmother, Maria Theresa, and her 2 daughters. For a Habsburg wedding, it was shockingly small and private, but none of that mattered to Franz Ferdinand. On that day, he married the woman he loved, and by all accounts, he never regretted it for a single moment. Years later, he would write in his diary that marrying Sophie was the smartest decision he ever made. In a life filled with disappointment, resentment, and political frustration, Sophie was his refuge, his joy, his reason for happiness. But the price they paid for their love was steep, and it would shadow them for the rest of their lives. If you had met Franz Ferdinand at a court function or official event, you probably wouldn't have liked him very much. The German historian Michael Freund later described him as a man of uninspired energy, dark in appearance and emotion, who radiated an aura of strangeness. Other contemporaries were even less kind. He was called cold, sharp-tongued, short-tempered, prideful, mistrusting, and irascible. He lacked charisma and had poor social skills. He was a terrible linguist. Ironically, one condition of his Este inheritance was that he learn Italian, which he hated and never mastered. In meetings with Emperor Franz Joseph, witnesses reported that thunder and lightning always raged. The 2 men brought out the worst in each other, their mutual antipathy poisoning every interaction. Franz Ferdinand felt undervalued and disrespected. The emperor found his nephew difficult and ungrateful. At court, Franz Ferdinand was often sullen and withdrawn. He had few friends among the aristocracy and seemed to actively dislike most of them. He was particularly venomous toward the Hungarians, whom he called rabble and traitors, blaming them for what he saw as the empire's dysfunction. But here's what makes Franz Ferdinand so fascinating. His private life was completely different. At home, away from the court, with Sophie and their children, Franz Ferdinand was a different man entirely. He was warm, affectionate, playful, and devoted. He spent as much time as possible with his family, often at their estates far from Vienna. He was a hands-on father who took genuine interest in his children's lives and education. Sophie later said that her husband's greatest joy was simply being with his family. The man who seemed so cold and difficult in public melted in private, revealing a capacity for love and tenderness that shocked those few who witnessed it. This split between public and private persona wasn't just about personality, it was about pain. Franz Ferdinand was acutely aware of how Sophie was treated at court. Despite being his wife, she was openly snubbed and humiliated by the very people who should have shown her respect. She couldn't sit with him at official dinners. She couldn't ride in the same carriage during processions. At court balls, she had to stand with the minor nobility, while her husband sat with the imperial family. Every slight against Sophie was a wound to Franz Ferdinand. It grieved him deeply and made him increasingly reclusive. He began avoiding court functions whenever possible, preferring to stay at his private estates, where Sophie could be treated as what she was, his beloved wife and the mother of his children. There was one notable exception to this pattern of rejection. In November 1913, King George V and Queen Mary of Britain invited Franz Ferdinand and Sophie to Windsor Castle. There, for perhaps the first time in their marriage, Sophie was welcomed and treated with the full dignity of her position. The British royal family showed them genuine warmth and respect. It was a brief glimpse of what their life might have been like in a less rigid society. But such moments were rare. For the most part, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie lived in a kind of gilded exile. Wealthy and powerful, yet perpetually reminded that their love was considered inappropriate by the very empire Franz Ferdinand was destined to rule. This experience profoundly shaped his political views and his vision for the empire's future, a vision that would make him enemies and, some historians argue, ultimately contribute to his assassination. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie had 4 pregnancies together. 3 resulted in healthy children who would become the center of their father's world. 1 ended in heartbreak. Their first child, Sophie, was born on July 24, 1901, just over a year after their wedding. She was named after her mother and would grow up to be intelligent, strong-willed, and devoted to her family's memory. Their first son, Maximilian, arrived
on September 29, 1902.
He would inherit much of his father's serious demeanor and sense of duty. Their second son, Ernst, was born on May 17, 1904, completing their family. In 1908, Sophie became pregnant again, but this pregnancy ended in tragedy with a stillborn son. The loss affected both parents deeply, but they still had 3 healthy children to love and raise. Because of the morganatic marriage, these children could not use their father's titles or name. Instead, they took their mother's newly created title, von Hohenberg. They were Prince and Princesses von Hohenberg, not Archdukes and Archduchess of Austria. They were excluded from the succession, barred from inheriting the throne their father would one day occupy. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie made a conscious decision about how to raise their children. Rather than trying to force them into the imperial world that had rejected their mother, they chose to raise them as country gentry. The family lived primarily at their private estates, Konopište and Klum in Bohemia, and Archstetten in Lower Austria. Years later, their daughter Sophie recalled that they were raised to know they were nothing special. This wasn't about diminishing them, it was about protecting them. Franz Ferdinand wanted his children to have the normal, happy childhood he had never experienced. He wanted them to be free from the suffocating protocol and political intrigue of the Viennese court. He was, by all accounts, a devoted and loving father. He played with his children, took interest in their education, and spent as much time with them as his duties allowed. In an era when aristocratic fathers were often distant figures, Franz Ferdinand was remarkably hands-on, but he couldn't protect them from everything. The children were aware, even at young ages, that they were different. They knew their mother was treated poorly at court. They understood that their father's family looked down on them. Young Sophie, Maximilian, and Ernst grew up in a strange liminal space, wealthy and privileged, yet somehow not quite legitimate in the eyes of the empire. Franz Ferdinand's love for his children was fierce and protective. He was determined that they would have good lives, even if those lives couldn't include the throne. He carefully managed his estate fortune to ensure they would be financially secure. He taught them to be proud of their mother's family and heritage. In many ways, his children humanized him. The cold, difficult Archduke that the court knew was not the man his children knew. To Sophie, Max, and Ernst, he was simply Papa, someone who loved them unconditionally and would do anything to protect them. This family life, this private happiness, was Franz Ferdinand's sanctuary from the political storms that were gathering around him. Because as heir to the throne, he wasn't just a father and husband, he was also a political figure with controversial ideas about the empire's future. And those ideas were making him enemies. To understand why Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, you need to understand his political vision and why it terrified so many people. The Austro-Hungarian Empire in the early 20th century was a patchwork of nationalities, languages, and cultures held together by the Habsburg dynasty. The Compromise of 1867 had created a dual monarchy. Austria and Hungary were separate kingdoms with their own governments, united only by the emperor and common foreign and military policies. This system, called dualism, gave enormous power to the Hungarian elite. They controlled their half of the empire with an iron fist, suppressing the rights of Slavic minorities, Slovaks, Romanians, Serbs, and Croats, who made up the majority of Hungary's population. Franz Ferdinand hated this system. He believed dualism was tearing the empire apart and that Hungarian dominance was unsustainable. He had a particular loathing for the Hungarian aristocracy, whom he blamed for the empire's problems. He called them rabble and traitors, and made no secret of his desire to break their power. His solution was radical: trialism. Instead of 2 equal partners, Austria and Hungary, he wanted 3: Germans, Magyars, and Slavs. He envisioned giving the empire's Slavic populations, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes, equal status and representation. Some versions of his plan went even further, proposing a federal structure with as many as 16 autonomous states. Now, before we paint Franz Ferdinand as some kind of progressive hero, we need to be clear: he wasn't a Democrat. He was deeply conservative and opposed to democracy. His goal wasn't to empower people, it was to strengthen the crown and preserve the empire. He believed that by giving Slavs a stake in the system, he could prevent nationalist movements from tearing the empire apart. But even this conservative reform was revolutionary in its implications. The Hungarian elite would lose their privileged position. The German-speaking bureaucracy would have to share power. The entire structure of the empire would be transformed. In 1913, Franz Ferdinand wrote a letter to Foreign Minister Leopold von Berchtold that reveals his thinking about the South Slavs, the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. He argued that these people needed a comfortable, fair, and good life within the empire. He opposed aggressive policies towards Serbia, warning that harsh treatment would only fuel independence movements and potentially bring war with Russia. This is crucial to understanding the tragedy of his assassination. Franz Ferdinand was actually sympathetic to Slavic aspirations. He just wanted those aspirations fulfilled within the empire, not through independence. He was one of the few voices in Vienna arguing against war with Serbia. But to Serbian nationalists, Franz Ferdinand's reforms were actually more threatening than the status quo. If he succeeded in making the empire attractive to Slavs, it would undermine the entire project of creating independent Slavic states. A satisfied Slavic population within a reformed Austria-Hungary would have no reason to join a greater Serbia or Yugoslavia. Gavrilo Princip, Franz Ferdinand's assassin, later stated that preventing these reforms was one of his motivations. The Archduke had to die precisely because his ideas might have worked. Franz Ferdinand's political views extended beyond constitutional reform. He was deeply involved in military affairs and had strong opinions about foreign policy. He was anti-Prussian by instinct, but had grown closer to Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany through personal friendship. He opposed the influence of the military hawks who wanted war with Serbia. In 1907, he had secured the retirement of Friedrich von Beck-Rizikowski as chief of the general staff, and personally selected the replacement, Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf. This turned out to be a terrible choice. Conrad was a war hawk who constantly pushed for preventive war against Serbia and Italy. But at the time, Franz Ferdinand believed he could control him. By 1913, Franz Ferdinand had been appointed Inspector General of all the armed forces of Austria-Hungary. This gave him significant influence over military policy, even though he held no specific command. He used this position to try to modernize the army and prepare it for the challenges of 20th century warfare. His views on art and culture were decidedly less progressive. He was a fierce opponent of Viennese modernism, that explosion of artistic innovation that made early 20th century Vienna one of the cultural capitals of Europe. He blocked projects by Otto Wagner, one of the era's most important architects, and favored neo-Baroque styles that looked backward rather than forward. This conservatism in cultural matters reflected his broader worldview. He wanted to preserve and strengthen traditional institutions, not overthrow them. He was a reformer, yes, but a conservative reformer who wanted to save the empire by adapting it, not by democratizing it. All of these views, his opposition to Hungarian power, his sympathy for Slavic rights, his military influence, His conservative cultural politics made him a controversial figure. The Hungarian elite hated him. German nationalists distrusted him. Military hawks found him frustratingly cautious. Modernists saw him as an obstacle to progress, and Serbian nationalists saw him as the one man who might actually prevent the collapse of Austria-Hungary and the creation of a South Slavic state. In the spring of 1914, as Franz Ferdinand prepared for a trip to Bosnia to observe military maneuvers, all of these tensions were coming to a head. The empire was creaking under internal pressures. Nationalist movements were growing stronger. The great powers of Europe were locked in an arms race and an alliance system that made war increasingly likely. And in Sarajevo, a group of young revolutionaries was preparing to strike a blow for Serbian independence, a blow that would change the world forever. Franz Ferdinand's relationship with the military was complex and, in many ways, contradictory. He was a soldier by training and inclination, yet he was one of the few voices in Vienna consistently arguing against war. He had entered the army young, as was customary for Habsburg archdukes. His promotions came rapidly: lieutenant at 14, captain at 22, colonel at 27, major general at 31. These weren't just ceremonial ranks.
He actually led the 9th Hussar Regiment
and took his military duties seriously. However, Franz Ferdinand never received formal staff training, which meant he lacked the technical military education of professional officers. This didn't stop him from having strong opinions about military matters, which sometimes put him at odds with the professional military establishment. In 1898, shortly after being officially named heir to the throne, he was given a commission to investigate all branches of the military services. This was an enormous responsibility that gave him insight into every aspect of Austria-Hungary's armed forces, and what he found often alarmed him. He established a military chancery with a staff of 16, headed by Alexander Brosch von Arenau. This became his power base for influencing military policy. Through this office, he reviewed plans, made recommendations, and gradually built up his authority over military affairs. His most significant intervention came in 1907, when he secured the retirement of Friedrich von Beck-Rykowski, who had been Emperor Franz Joseph's confidant and chief of the general staff. This was a bold move that demonstrated Franz Ferdinand's growing influence. He then personally selected Beck's successor, Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf. This decision would have profound consequences. Conrad was brilliant but reckless, a man who believed that Austria-Hungary's problems could be solved through preventive war. He constantly advocated for military action against Serbia and Italy, arguing that the empire needed to strike before its enemies grew stronger. Franz Ferdinand initially believed he could control Conrad, but their relationship became increasingly strained. Conrad wanted war. Franz Ferdinand wanted to avoid it. They clashed repeatedly over policy, with Franz Ferdinand using his position to restrain Conrad's more aggressive impulses. In 1913, Franz Ferdinand reached the height of his military influence when he was appointed Inspector General of all the armed forces of Austria-Hungary. This position gave him authority over the entire military establishment, though he still didn't hold a specific command. But here's the paradox. Despite all this military power and his lifelong involvement with the army, Franz Ferdinand was fundamentally opposed to war, especially war with Serbia. He understood that war with Serbia would likely bring in Russia, which would activate the alliance system and potentially trigger a general European war. He believed that such a conflict would be catastrophic for Austria-Hungary, regardless of who won. The empire was already struggling with internal tensions. A major war might tear it apart completely. In his correspondence with government officials, Franz Ferdinand repeatedly argued for diplomatic solutions to conflicts with Serbia. He believed that harsh treatment of Slavic populations would only fuel nationalist movements and make war more likely. His proposed reforms were designed, in part, to address the grievances that made Serbian irredentism attractive to the empire's South Slavic subjects. This put him increasingly at odds with the war party in Vienna. Military hawks like Conrad, Foreign Minister Leopold von Berchtold, and others saw Franz Ferdinand as an obstacle to decisive action. They believed the empire needed to crush Serbia before it became too powerful, and they chafed under the restraint imposed by the heir to the throne. The tragic irony is that Franz Ferdinand's death removed the one voice that might have prevented war in July 1914. When the crisis came after his assassination, Emperor Franz Joseph was 84 years old and increasingly detached from day-to-day governance. The decision-making fell to men like Conrad and Berchtold, the very hawks Franz Ferdinand had spent years trying to restrain. Without Franz Ferdinand's moderating influence, the path to war became much easier. The man who had worked to prevent conflict became, through his death, the excuse for the very war he had feared. In the spring of 1914, General Oskar Potiorek, the governor of Bosnia-Herzegovina, invited Franz Ferdinand to observe military maneuvers in Bosnia. The exercises were scheduled for late June, and Potiorek suggested that the Archduke could combine his inspection duties with a visit to Sarajevo, the Bosnian capital. Franz Ferdinand accepted, and in a decision that would prove fateful, he decided to bring Sophie with him. This was significant, because Bosnia was one of the few places where Sophie could appear publicly with her husband, without the usual restrictions. Bosnia-Herzegovina had been occupied by Austria-Hungary since 1878 and formally annexed in 1908, a move that had outraged Serbia and inflamed South Slavic nationalism. But because it was a recently acquired territory without the rigid protocol of Vienna, Sophie could be treated as the Archduke's wife, rather than being relegated to a lower status. For Franz Ferdinand, this was a rare opportunity to travel with Sophie by his side, to have her treated with the dignity she deserved. It was also their 14th wedding anniversary. They had married on June 28, 1900. The trip would be a kind of anniversary celebration, but the date was significant for another reason. June 28th was Vidovdan, St. Vitus's Day, one of the most important dates in Serbian national consciousness. It was the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, when the Serbian medieval kingdom fell to the Ottoman Empire. For Serbian nationalists, it was a day of mourning and remembrance, a symbol of Serbian suffering and resistance. For the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne to visit Sarajevo on this date was seen by many Serbs as a deliberate provocation, though there's no evidence Franz Ferdinand intended it that way. He likely didn't even know the significance of the date, but Serbian nationalist groups knew, and they were preparing. The Black Hand was a secret military society dedicated to creating a greater Serbia through any means necessary, including terrorism and assassination. Its leader, Dragutin Dimitrijevic, known as Apis, was also the head of Serbian military intelligence. The organization had been involved in numerous plots and assassinations. Working with the Black Hand was a group of young Bosnian Serb revolutionaries called Young Bosnia. These were mostly students and intellectuals, passionate nationalists who dreamed of a South Slavic state free from Austrian rule. They were willing to die for their cause, and to kill for it. When they learned that Franz Ferdinand would be in Sarajevo on Vidovdan, they saw an opportunity. Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb, later stated that one of his motivations was to prevent Franz Ferdinand's reforms. The Archduke's plans to give Slavs greater autonomy within the empire threatened the nationalist project of creating an independent South Slavic state. If Franz Ferdinand succeeded in making the empire attractive to Slavs, the dream of a greater Serbia might die. The conspirators obtained weapons, pistols, and bombs from the Black Hand in Serbia and smuggled them across the border into Bosnia. There were 6 assassins in total, positioned along the route Franz Ferdinand's motorcade would take through Sarajevo. On the morning of June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie arrived in Sarajevo by train. They were driven to the city hall in an open car, a Graf and stiff touring car with the top down, making them clearly visible to the crowds lining the streets. The first assassin, Mohammed Mehmed Bashic, lost his nerve and didn't act. The second, Nedeljko Chabrinovic, did.
At approximately 10:10 a.m.,
as the motorcade passed by, Chabrinovic threw a hand grenade at Franz Ferdinand's car. Franz Ferdinand saw it coming. He raised his arm to deflect it, and the grenade bounced off the folded roof of the car and rolled into the street. It exploded under the following vehicle, injuring several people, including Lieutenant Colonel Erich von Marizi and Sophie's lady-in-waiting, Countess Sophie von Lanjus. The motorcade sped up and continued to City Hall. Chabrinovic swallowed a cyanide pill and jumped into the Miljacka River, but the cyanide was old and only made him vomit, and the river was only inches deep. He was quickly captured. At City Hall, Franz Ferdinand was furious. According to witnesses, he shouted at the mayor, "So, you welcome your guests with bombs?" Another account has him saying, "What is the good of your speeches? I come to Sarajevo on a visit, and I get bombs thrown at me. It is outrageous." But after he calmed down, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the people who had been injured in the bombing. The plan was to go to the hospital, then leave the city immediately. The route was changed to avoid the narrow streets of the old city center, where another attack might occur. But here's where everything went wrong. Franz Ferdinand's driver, Leopold Lojka, wasn't informed of the route change. When the motorcade left City Hall, he turned onto Franz Joseph Street, following the original route. General Potiorek, who was in the car, shouted at him to stop and turn around. The car stopped to reverse, right in front of Moritz Schiller's Delicatessen, and standing on the corner, having given up hope after the motorcade didn't follow the expected route, was 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip. He couldn't believe his luck. The car carrying his target had stopped directly in front of him, less than 5 feet away. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were sitting in the back seat, completely exposed. Princip pulled out his FN Model 1910 pistol and fired twice. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The second hit Sophie in the abdomen. Sophie collapsed onto her husband's lap. She asked, "For God's sake, what has happened to you?" Franz Ferdinand, blood pouring from his neck wound, tried to comfort her. His last words were, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." But Sophie was already dying. She lost consciousness within moments. Count Franz von Herrick, who was in the car, tried to help Franz Ferdinand. They were rushed to the governor's residence, but there was nothing doctors could do. Sophie died first, probably within minutes. Franz Ferdinand died shortly after,
at approximately 11 a.m.
In less than an hour, 2 gunshots had killed the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and his beloved wife. They left behind 3 children, Sophie, who was nearly 14, Maximilian, who was 11, and Ernst, who was just 8 years old. Gavrilo Princip tried to shoot himself, but was tackled by bystanders before he could. He also tried to swallow cyanide, but like Chabrinovic's, it was old and ineffective. He was beaten by the crowd and then arrested. The news spread quickly through Sarajevo, then to Vienna, then to the world. The heir to one of Europe's great empires had been assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. The question now was, what would Austria-Hungary do in response? Franz Ferdinand had left specific instructions about his burial. He did not want to be interred in the traditional Habsburg burial place, the Capuchin crypt in Vienna, where generations of emperors and empresses lay in elaborate sarcophagi. Instead, he wanted to be buried at Archstetten Castle, one of his private estates, in a crypt beneath the chapel. The reason was simple. He wanted to be with Sophie. Because of her morganatic status, Sophie could not be buried in the Capuchin crypt. Even in death, the Habsburg protocol would have separated them. So Franz Ferdinand had planned ahead, ensuring that they would rest together for eternity, away from the court that had never accepted their love. The funeral in Vienna was a final insult. Sophie's coffin was placed lower than Franz Ferdinand's, and her funeral regalia indicated her lower rank. The ceremony was brief and poorly attended by Habsburg standards. Emperor Franz Joseph, who had never reconciled with his nephew, showed little emotion. Then Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were taken to Archstetten, where they were buried side by side in the crypt Franz Ferdinand had prepared. Their tomb remains there today, a testament to a love that defied an empire. But while Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were being laid to rest, the political machinery of Europe was grinding toward catastrophe. Austria-Hungary's government faced a decision: how to respond to the assassination. The evidence quickly emerged that the weapons had come from Serbia, that Serbian military intelligence had been involved, that this was not just the act of a lone fanatic, but part of a broader conspiracy. The hawks in Vienna, men like Konrad von Hotzendorf and Foreign Minister Berchtold, saw an opportunity. They had long wanted to crush Serbia, and now they had the perfect justification. They began drafting an ultimatum with demands so harsh that Serbia could not possibly accept them all.
But they faced a problem: Russia.
If Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, Russia would likely intervene to protect its Slavic ally. And if Russia intervened, Germany would support Austria-Hungary, France would support Russia, and the alliance system would drag all of Europe into war. In the past, Franz Ferdinand would have been the voice arguing for restraint, for diplomatic solutions, for avoiding the very war he had spent years warning against. But Franz Ferdinand was dead. The man who might have prevented the war was gone, killed by the very act that would be used to justify it. Emperor Franz Joseph was 84 years old, increasingly frail, and detached from day-to-day governance. He deferred to his ministers and generals, and they wanted war.
On July 23, 1914, nearly a month after the assassination,
Austria-Hungary delivered its ultimatum to Serbia. The demands were deliberately humiliating and included provisions that would have violated Serbian sovereignty. Serbia accepted most of the demands but rejected a few key points. It was enough. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after Franz Ferdinand's death, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The alliance system activated like a row of falling dominoes. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France mobilized to support Russia. Germany invaded Belgium to attack France. Britain declared war on Germany to protect Belgian neutrality. Within weeks, all of Europe was at war. The conflict that Franz Ferdinand had worked to prevent, that he had warned would be catastrophic for Austria-Hungary, had begun, triggered by his own assassination. The war lasted 4 years and claimed approximately 17 million lives. It destroyed 4 empires: the German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman. It redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East. It set the stage for an even more devastating conflict 20 years later. And Austria-Hungary, the empire Franz Ferdinand had hoped to reform and preserve, was torn apart. In 1918, it dissolved into multiple nation-states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and parts of Poland, Romania, and Italy. The South Slavic state that Gavrilo Princip had dreamed of, Yugoslavia, was created, but would prove to be troubled and unstable,
eventually collapsing in the 1990s
in a series of brutal wars. As for Franz Ferdinand's children,
they were taken in by Prince Jaroslav von Thun und Hohenstein,
a family friend. They lost not only their parents, but also much of their inheritance. In 1918, when Czechoslovakia was created, the new government confiscated their Bohemian estates, including Konopiste Castle, with its 100,000 hunting trophies. The children grew up in a world utterly transformed from the one their father had known. In 1938, both sons, Maximilian and Ernst, were arrested by the Gestapo for making anti-Nazi statements. They were sent to Dachau concentration camp, where they spent over a year before being released through the intervention of American officials. Both survived the war. Sophie, the eldest, lived the longest. She married and had children, preserving the family line. She died in 1990, having lived through both world wars, the Cold War, and the fall of communism, a witness to the entire tumultuous century that her father's death had helped to create. Maximilian died in 1962, Ernst in 1954. All three children spent their lives dealing with the legacy of their father's assassination and the loss of the world they had been born into. Franz Ferdinand is remembered today primarily for how he died, rather than how he lived. In most history books, he appears for a few paragraphs. The man whose assassination started World War I, the complexity of his life, the tragedy of his love story, the controversial nature of his political ideas, all of this is usually reduced to a footnote. But his story deserves to be told in full, because it reveals so much about the world that was lost in 1914. He was a man of contradictions, cold and difficult in public, warm and loving in private, a conservative who planned radical reforms, a soldier who opposed war, a Habsburg who defied his family for love, a hunter who pressed flowers in books, a man who radiated an aura of strangeness yet inspired fierce loyalty in those who knew him well. His love story with Sophie is genuinely moving. A 14-year romance that defied an empire, that survived humiliation and rejection, that remained strong until the moment they died together in Sarajevo. In an age of arranged marriages and dynastic calculations, Franz Ferdinand chose love over duty, and he never regretted it. His political vision, whatever its flaws, represented a genuine attempt to solve the empire's problems. Whether trialism would have worked, we'll never know. But the fact that Serbian nationalists saw him as enough of a threat to assassinate him suggests that his ideas might have had real potential. The greatest tragedy is that Franz Ferdinand died trying to prevent the very thing his death caused. He had spent years arguing against war with Serbia, warning that it would be catastrophic, pushing for diplomatic solutions and internal reforms. And then his assassination became the excuse for the war he had feared, unleashed by the very people he had spent years trying to restrain. On June 28, 1914, 2 gunshots in Sarajevo didn't just kill a man and his wife. They killed a possible future, a reformed Austria-Hungary that might have survived, a Europe that might have avoided the catastrophe of World War I, a 20th century that might have been very different. We can't know what would have happened if Franz Ferdinand had lived. Perhaps his reforms would have failed. Perhaps the empire would have collapsed anyway. Perhaps the war would have come through some other crisis. But we do know what did happen. And we know that the world that emerged from the ashes of World War I was darker, more violent, and more tragic than almost anyone in 1914 could have imagined. Franz Ferdinand deserves to be remembered not just as the man whose death started a war, but as a complex, flawed, fascinating human being who loved deeply, thought seriously about his empire's future, and died alongside the woman he had defied the world to marry. His last words were for her, Sophie. Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children. But she couldn't, and neither could he. And the children they left behind, Sophie, Maximilian, and Ernst, grew up in a world their father never imagined, shaped by forces his death had unleashed. That's the real story of Franz Ferdinand. Not just how he died, but how he lived, how he loved, and how his death changed everything. Thank you for watching. If you found this video educational, please like and subscribe for more in-depth historical documentaries. And let me know in the comments what aspect of Franz Ferdinand's life surprised you most.